Welcome, everybody. Thank you for joining us. We're going to get started in just a few minutes. We're going to let folks trickle into the webinar. Welcome, everyone, to our Everglades webinar. We're going to get started in just a minute. All right, let's dive in. Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Olivia. I'm the VP of Operations and Programs with the CLEO Institute, and welcome to our Everglades webinar in partnership with the National Parks Conservation Association. We're super excited about this partnership that we've had for the past few years. At the end of this webinar, I'll talk a little bit about a really cool opportunity that we're offering thanks to the NPCA for our youth Gen CLEO membership. So before we dive in, I just want to go over a little bit of housekeeping. This is a digital webinar, so if we experience any technical difficulties, we just ask that you be patient and bear with us. We're having a little bit of weather here in South Florida, so that might impact our internet or some of our other digital tools. We are going to be leaving ample time at the end of the webinar for questions and answers, but we're asking that you use the Q&A function. You can find this on the bottom of your Zoom tool webinar. You just click the icon, the box will open, and you can type in your question at any point in the webinar, and at the end, we'll address all those questions. We'll be using the chat function, but for other purposes, so we're asking that you keep your questions in the Q&A function. And finally, we are going to be sending out a follow-up email to everyone who's attended and everyone who's registered. We're going to include the recording of today's webinar, and we're also going to include any resources or links that are shared throughout, so don't worry. If anything is shared in the chat, we will record it and we'll add it to the follow-up email. So for those of you who don't know or who are new to CLEO, we are a nonprofit, nonpartisan organization that is exclusively dedicated to climate change, education, engagement, and advocacy. And through our work, our trainings, and our programs, one of our key messaging is about the intersectionality of the climate crisis. And that's because everything is connected to the climate crisis, and the climate crisis is a threat multiplier. And when we look at this through the lens of biodiversity, this is especially true. So nature, biodiversity, our ecosystems provide what we call ecosystem services. These are benefits that are free of charge that enhance and support our livelihoods. Everything from food, water, medicine, shelter, even recreation and cultural benefits are offered from our ecosystems. And so it's important to understand the benefits that these ecosystems offer in order to understand the importance of protecting them. And our Everglades are no exception. And so our guest today is going to deep dive into this, but I want to highlight 3 ecosystem benefits that are offered by the Everglades that are in our backyard right here in South Florida. So the Everglades provide fresh drinking water to millions of South Floridians. They are home to hundreds of animal and plant species, in some cases that don't exist anywhere else. But the Everglades also help build resilience in our communities, mainly through flood mitigation. And so it's important for us to understand this ecosystem better in order for us to understand why we want to protect it. And so without further ado, I would love to introduce to you today's guest speaker and facilitator, Kara Kapp. She's the Senior Everglades Program Manager at National Parks Conservation Association. She works to restore and protect natural resources in and around Florida's national parks as the Suncoast Everglades Restoration Senior Program Manager. Kara, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. I'll go ahead and start sharing my presentation, so bear with me for just a moment. Okay. Well, hi again, everyone. I'm Kara Kapp. I am the Senior Everglades Program Manager for the National Parks Conservation Association, and I'm really excited to join you today. For nearly 15 years, I've worked as a conservation advocate in South Florida, And NPCA really values our partnership with the CLEO Institute and the important work that your team does to bolster the climate movement. And so I'm excited to talk to you about the Everglades today, the history of the park, of the ecosystem, of our work to restore the Everglades, and why this is such a critical effort for our climate resilient future. So first, I'll tell you just a little bit about NPCA and who we are. The National Parks Conservation Association was established over a century ago by some of the same founding conservationists who created America's national park system. We said if we have national parks, we need park protectors, and that's us at NPCA. Our mission is to protect and enhance our national parks for future generations. We are headquartered in Washington, D.C., and we have regional offices all around the country. We have 1.6 million members and supporters nationwide, including over 100,000 here in Florida. We are a nonprofit, nonpartisan group, just like CLEO. And while we do work closely with the National Park Service, we are not the federal government. We're not quite a friends group either. We think of ourselves more like a big sibling group. We love our parks and our rangers and our scientists, and we want to support them. But sometimes we do intervene even with legal action when we see that the parks need better protection. We believe that that mission of protecting and enhancing our national parks is one worth fighting for. I've been with NPCA for over 10 years, and I feel really proud to be a park advocate. Florida is home to 11 national park sites. Some are probably really familiar to you. You visited them and you can name them easily, and others might be waiting for you to explore. I wanted to invite everyone in the chat just before we dive into the Everglades to share a national park, either in Florida or beyond, that you visited most recently to get a sense of where this group likes to explore. So I'll pause just a minute and invite you to pop that in the chat. I see Biscayne, Yellowstone, Grand Teton. Okay, this is a group that's doing some traveling. Another Biscayne, lots of people sharing experiences at our local parks here in South Florida. So glad to see we definitely have some park lovers and explorers in the group. So of the 11 national parks in Florida, I'm going to focus on highlighting just a few that are part of the greater Everglades ecosystem. First of all, Biscayne National Park, certainly familiar to many of you. It is our nation's largest marine national park. It protects coral reefs, mangrove forests, and 10,000 years of human history, including shipwrecks and lighthouses to explore. Big Cypress National Preserve in the Western Everglades is actually our nation's first national preserve. It's home to the endangered Florida panther and the elusive ghost orchid, if you're lucky enough to ever see one. And of course, Everglades National Park, 1.5 million acres of protected habitat and watershed that's known and regarded as both a national and international treasure. The Everglades is a World Heritage Site, an International Biosphere Reserve, a wetland of international importance, and it's also one of the most popular national parks in our country, welcoming well over 1 million visitors every year. Everglades National Park protects an unparalleled landscape that's home to numerous rare and endangered species, like the West Indian manatee, the American crocodile, and the Florida panther, wading birds like the colorful roseate spoonbill, and literally thousands of other plant and animal species who live among the park's 9 distinct habitats. It is the first national park designated not for its scenic vistas, but for its biodiversity. And while the Everglades we know and love today is really a spectacular landscape, we also know that the Everglades of today is only a fraction of what it once was. And I'm lucky enough to be one of the relatively small but determined community of folks working to protect what we have left of the Everglades and to restore some of what's been lost. And so with that, I will jump into the story of Everglades National Park. The historic Everglades was twice the size of the state of New Jersey. It spanned from modern-day Disney World all the way down to the Florida Keys. We like to say you could have gone from what is today the Magic Kingdom all the way down to Margaritaville, and all of that would have been the Everglades. From there, it really started at the meandering Kissimmee River in the Orlando area, would deposit into Lake Okeechobee, the massive liquid heart of our state. And then Lake Okeechobee really didn't have a hard southern border. Instead, the water would gently spill over and form that slow-moving river of grass. And it would head all the way south to what we now recognize as Everglades National Park and the waters of the Florida Keys. This shallow, slow-moving sheet of water covered almost 11,000 square miles, and that process would purify the water so that only the most pristine flow would enter the southern Everglades. This was a unique system of water flow and water filtration that means there's no other Everglades anywhere else on Earth. The natural flow was ideal for wildlife, but it was a major barrier for turn-of-the-century visionaries who thought they could tame the wild Everglades. In the early 1900s, the federal government ceded 20 million acres of public land to the state of Florida on the one condition that we drain the Everglades and make them developable. The goal was to provide a new frontier for America and a boom in our nation's economy. And so we did just that. By 1917, the Everglades was dissected by a series of canals that flowed water away from the river of grass that had existed in peace and harmony for so many centuries. Water that once flowed freely to the southern Everglades and to Florida Bay was now diverted to the Gulf of Mexico to the west and the Atlantic Ocean to the east through new human-made connections. These changes of over 100 years ago are still causing significant harm in our Everglades and in our estuaries today. So now we can look back and see that we had made a huge mistake. At the time, it felt like a real success. There were newly dry lands immediately south of Lake Okeechobee, and they had really rich soil that were ideal for agriculture. It's the area that today we call the EAA, the Everglades Agricultural Area. The soil there, remember, had been absorbing all of the nutrients from the water that was flowing out of the lake for centuries. And so the soil was extremely fertile and found to be great for harvesting vegetables, citrus, and especially sugarcane. In the years that followed, Henry Flagler built his rail line into South Florida. And soon after that, the widespread production of modern day air conditioning really started to change the landscape of our state. By the 1920s, Florida's cities were booming, and change has only gotten exponentially more intense since then. What was once a vast swamp now looks more like this. And all of this leads to huge problems for our Everglades. First of all, overdevelopment. We've lost about 50% of the Everglades habitat that we once had, 70% of natural water flow, which was once coming through the river of grass. And we've also lost the pristine nature of that water. Now we have pollution from our communities, from agriculture, from highways and cars, all of that impacting the downstream Everglades. These impacts are felt not only by the wildlife, but also by members of the indigenous communities, the Miccosukee tribe and the Seminole tribe, who have resided in the Everglades and Big Cypress since time immemorial. The tribes have always lived in the Everglades and continue to be impacted by harmful development as well. But all wasn't lost. Around this same time, there was a growing movement to not only to understand, but also to protect what remained of the Everglades. And Marjorie Stoneman Douglas was really a focal figure in that effort. Marjorie had been actually a suffragette fighting for the women's right to vote, and then very involved in the civil rights movement before turning her eye towards environmental advocacy. She came to Miami as a writer for the Miami Herald, and she wrote really popular stories about lifestyles in South Florida and in the Everglades that garnered national interest. People were very curious about what was going on in Florida. And over time, Marjorie began to notice changes, most notably in the wading bird patterns and also in the water flow. She coined the phrase river of grass and wrote the famous book that really called to mind the need to protect what remained of the Everglades in the face of this movement towards more and more development. At the same time, Marjorie's friend and actually a colleague of hers from the Miami Herald, a man named Ernest Coe, began to advocate for the creation of a national park in South Florida, one that he hoped would encompass the spanning and diverse habitats that make up the entire greater Everglades. He lobbied hard He took members of Congress and the Department of the Interior out to see the Everglades, even by Goodyear blimp. He would rent the Goodyear blimp to bring national leaders because he felt so strongly that if people could really get a grasp of the beauty and the scale of the Everglades, they would feel compelled to protect it. In the end, he was successful in preserving a very large portion of the Everglades, though not as large as he actually wanted. And he is really the reason we have that first large section of Everglades National Park that was protected and that we celebrate today. Everglades National Park was finally established in 1947 by President Truman. And as I mentioned before, but I really want to emphasize again because this is so significant, it was the first park designated specifically for its biodiversity. At the dedication ceremony, President Truman proclaimed, "Here is land, tranquil in its quiet beauty, serving not as the source of water, but as the last receiver of it. To its natural abundance, we owe the spectacular plant and animal life that distinguishes this place from all others in our country." The park's designation was also significant in that it acknowledged that the ecosystem was not pristine, but had been damaged and was in need of care and rehabilitation. So we have always known that Everglades National Park was a place that needed to be not only protected, but also restored. If you visit Everglades National Park today, and if you enter through Homestead, you'll likely visit the Ernest Coe Visitor Center. And if you do, you'll know the story of the man who spearheaded the effort to establish a national park, and hopefully carry with you that reminder that any person with a bold idea and determination really can make a lasting difference. Since the park was established, we have added a network of other public lands to the Greater Everglades, more aligned with Ernest Coe's vision for broad landscape protection. These areas include Biscayne National Park, Big Cypress National Preserve, the Loxahatchee National Wildlife Refuge, managed by the Fish and Wildlife Service, the Florida Keys National Marine Sanctuary, and a significant network of state-owned parks and conservation lands and water conservation areas. And yet, as much as we've done to preserve the Everglades, the system of water that is so integral to the ecosystem is still badly broken. In the decades that followed the park's designation, we came to understand that to preserve the Everglades, we must do more than just set aside land, but also proactively work to restore the water that once flowed. And that's what Everglades restoration is all about, getting the water right. You never know just what group of people might be in the right place at the right time to make a difference in this world. A couple of Miami Herald reporters who first called for the park's designation made a big impact. And it was actually a group of fishing guides who led the charge for fixing our broken water system. And it all began in Florida Bay. Florida Bay is that large, shallow lagoon that sits right between the southernmost point of the Florida Peninsula and the Florida Keys. It's made up of a series of shallow basins, typically covered with and stabilized by seagrass. The basins of Florida Bay provide unique habitat for plants, birds, manatees, and fish. In fact, Florida Bay is considered a top fishing destination worldwide and is known and loved by anglers for its abundant fisheries and iconic views on the water. Florida Bay is truly beautiful. It's serene, it's unlike anywhere on Earth, and much of the bay is protected within the boundaries of Everglades National Park. And so while most people think of the Everglades as being swampy and full of alligators, which it definitely is, this is also the Everglades. And this part of the Everglades is in trouble because we've cut off its main source of clean, abundant water, that is the flow that should be coming from Lake Okeechobee through the River of Grass, through the Southern Everglades, and into Florida Bay. When we developed away 50% of the Everglades footprint and drained the swamp, we diminished water flow to Florida Bay by 70%. In the 1980s, that diminished water flow combined with a harsh dry season that offered very little rainfall put Florida Bay in severe drought. Widespread seagrass die-offs and fish kills followed, and frankly, not many people noticed. This is a really remote bay. It's difficult to navigate. It's not super accessible to the public unless you own your own boat. But who did notice? It was those anglers, the fishing guides, who make their living taking people out onto the water. And especially because people who had spent their previous vacation days hiring these guides and coming out to the Keys came, and instead of finding, a fishing heaven, they found dead, stinky seagrass. And so this was really a difficult time for the fishing community in the Keys, as well as the ecosystem of the Southern Everglades and Florida Bay. A few of those fishing guides were well connected enough to get the attention of agency leaders and members of Congress, and they started a movement calling on those folks to fulfill the national promise we made when establishing Everglades National Park to repair the ecosystem and truly ensure the Everglades would be around for future generations. A decade of scientific analysis, planning, and advocacy went into the creation of a sweeping plan aimed at restoring the Everglades and ultimately led to one of the most significant environmental milestones in America's history. In 2000, Congress passed the bipartisan Comprehensive Everglades Restoration Plan. We call it CERP. The plan was and still is historic. It is the largest ecosystem restoration project ever attempted in the world. Over 60 individual project components, decades of work, billions of dollars aimed at restoring the Everglades. CERP is a partnership between the federal government and the state of Florida. It was signed by President Bill Clinton, a Democrat, and Governor Jeb Bush, a Republican. It was authorized in Congress by a wild vote of 394 to 14, garnering support that crossed political aisles and state boundaries. Today, it is nearly impossible to think of a multi-billion-dollar initiative getting that kind of bipartisan support or really seeing any type of legislation passed that overwhelmingly in Congress, which I think really speaks to the significance of the Everglades. But also, if we're being honest, it maybe speaks to a time in our country when people were more ready to work together. And luckily, we got CERP authorized when we did. So how does it work? Over 60 individual projects make up the entire CERP program. This is a very detailed and complicated map, and I don't expect you to be able to read all of these. Each project is aimed at improving water quality, restoring natural habitat, providing water storage, reconnecting fragmented habitat, or some combination of all of those benefits. The U.S. Army Corps of Engineers is the federal agency that manages CERP, and the state half of this 50-50 partnership is managed by the South Florida Water Management District. So those are really the two agencies charged with restoring the Everglades. Each individual project component goes through a detailed planning phase, including public review, will need additional congressional authorization, and most importantly, it will need funding to move the project from a planning phase into a construction phase so we can actually start to flow some more water and clean some more water. The goal, of course, is a completed project that delivers on those ecosystem goals we set out for all those years ago, but all of it hinges, frankly, on money. The people who work at the agencies, the planners, the scientists, the engineers, they need funding to be allocated every single year by the Florida legislature and by Congress to make this work happen. There's some funding need involved in project planning, of course, but the real expense comes when it's time to build these projects. When CERP was first authorized, the idea was that the state of Florida and Congress would each put in $200 million per year to fund Everglades restoration. If that had been the case and that funding had come through, we would have completed all of these projects in about 30 years. That was not the case. Instead, CERP was getting only a fraction of the funding that it needed every single year, and so the projects have been falling farther and farther behind. 15 years after CERP was first authorized, very little progress had been made, and another environmental catastrophe was just around the corner. In 2015, the broken water system that took water meant for purification through the River of Grass and out to the Everglades, and instead shunted that water to Florida's east and west coasts, finally gave way to disaster. High volumes of polluted water from Lake Okeechobee being discharged to the west, that's through the Caloosahatchee River near Fort Myers, and to the east through the St. Lucie River, that's like northern Palm Beach County, and to Martin County, caused widespread toxic algae blooms that killed marine wildlife, closed beaches, and really had a huge impact on our tourism economy. Not only was it an ecological and an economic crisis, but also a public health crisis. Emergency rooms were flooded with people who were sick, were experiencing shortness of breath, and Baptist Health in Martin County actually reported that when someone showed up sick in the emergency room, the first question they would ask is, have you been in contact with the water? That's how serious this algae bloom was. And so clearly, this was a crisis that could no longer be ignored. Whereas that toxic algae bloom that killed the seagrass in Florida Bay was fairly remote and only seen by the fishing guides, by contrast, this was a very visible catastrophe. These are coastal communities where people live and businesses try to thrive. And so it became very clear that we needed a solution. And the small silver lining here was that we already had one. We have Everglades restoration projects ready to be put into action if only the funding would come through. And so advocates like myself got to work. We reminded our elected leaders that we have a dormant plan sitting on a shelf waiting to jump into action. And in these past few years, luckily, the funding levels have really turned around and we're making significant progress. So up until now, I've told you a lot about the journey of the Everglades, how it was dismantled, how it became a national park, and the start of that path towards restoration. And maybe we're at a bit of a cliffhanger moment. We're in the middle of a crisis. Can we fix this? And so we're going to shift a little bit and tell you a story about advocacy and the power of people making a difference with one specific restoration project that is really delivering on a lot of benefits in Miami. So as an environmental advocate, I sit right at that intersection between science and policy. It's important to speak enough science to understand the researchers, but also to understand the political dynamics and the funding processes and have the communication skills to bridge that gap between the people who know how to restore the Everglades and the people who can make it happen. So I'm going to tell you one advocacy story about the Everglades. And it's a story about Tamiami Trail. Tamiami Trail is the historic roadway that connects Tampa and Miami. Right around the same time that we were dismantling the Everglades, Florida's leaders realized that it would be beneficial to the state's economy to have a highway connecting our two major cities, Tampa and Miami. It took 13 years and over 2.6 million sticks of dynamite to pave the way for the first highway that would connect Florida's east and west coasts. And the road was built, of course, straight through the Everglades. Remember that we've lost about 70% of the historic flow that was coming down from Lake Okeechobee, and now that remaining 30% gets really bottlenecked right at the northern part of Everglades National Park, where Tamiami Trail cuts across. The park is in permanent parched state, waiting for water to come down. In the 90s, a group of conservationists and scientists began to envision a solution to the obstacle that is Tamiami Trail. If we could bridge the road, allow water to flow underneath, as well as wildlife to move underneath, we could reconnect the central and southern Everglades. The National Park Service scientists proposed a 3-part bridging project that would elevate strategic sections of Tamiami Trail to maximize that hydrologic flow of water underneath. It was envisioned not only as an ecosystem restoration project, but actually also as a public safety improvement project, because the roadway itself is still a major thoroughfare, as everyone who lives in Miami knows, and the road itself was becoming to crumble and be dilapidated. It was quite old. So it took a lot of planning and momentum building and over a decade of advocacy, but Congress authorized a plan to bridge Tamiami Trail in 2009. By 2013, the first 1-mile section of bridging was finally complete 2 decades after the project was first envisioned. It is not quite as grand looking as that conceptual drawing that I showed on the previous slide, but very importantly, it works. Water flows under the bridge, alligators swim underneath, and more water began to flow into the Everglades. Very often, success can bring more success, and so the project picked up momentum. Our team at NPCA was back walking the halls of Congress, asking for funding for the National Park Service to be able to complete the second phase out of 3 of Tamiami Trail bridging. Eventually, we did secure that funding and construction began. The second bridge section, this one is 2.5 miles long, which is quite long compared to the first 1 mile section, was completed in 2019. I was in Everglades National Park when the first trickles of water started coming underneath the second bridge, and it was just a tremendous day. So by 2019, we have 2 sections down, 1 more to go. Around this time, I got a call from some of our friends at Everglades National Park. They have a detailed plan ready for the third and final phase of elevating Tamiami Trail, but no money. Like I said, everything comes down to the funding. So they shared with me that there was a specific grant opportunity from the U.S. Department of Transportation to apply for funding improvements to roadways of national significance, which this one certainly is. And so NPCA stepped in to help secure this funding for Everglades National Park. So thinking about the political climate at the time, it was 2019, we were under the Trump administration. The Secretary of the U.S. Department of Transportation was Elaine Chao. She's the wife of Senator Mitch McConnell, who's a national Republican leader. And also in 2019, Florida had recently elected Rick Scott to the U.S. Senate to work alongside our longtime Senator Marco Rubio, who are also both Republicans and good colleagues of Secretary Chao at the Department of Transportation. And we knew that the decision about this funding was really in her hands. And so we got to work. I headed down to Senator Rubio's office in Miami. I flew up to Senator Scott's office in Tallahassee, and we had one request. Would the senators be willing to write letters of support to Secretary Chao for Everglades National Park to get the funding needing to bridge Tamiami Trail? And they both said yes. We had a few more tricks up our sleeves, so we also got letters of support from the fishing guides associations in the Keys who wanted to see this project done, as well as from the Miami-Dade Chamber of Commerce. And in the end, that was enough support to secure the funding. The U.S. Department of Transportation provided $60 million to Everglades National Park to complete the third and final phase of the Tamiami Trail Bridge project. Everglades National Park awarded that construction contract in 2020, and the project is expected to be fully complete next year, 2025. Once finished, Tamiami Trail will be water invisible, as the park scientists like to tell me, meaning there is zero impediment to natural water flow entering the Everglades from Tamiami Trail. In the 90s, this was a dream, and today it's nearly reality, thanks to a combination of scientists, engineers, policymakers, and advocates. There are many challenges remaining in the Everglades: habitat loss due to overdevelopment, water quality issues. We haven't even touched the invasive species crisis, and certainly climate change is a huge threat. But at the same time, there are dedicated scientists, researchers, engineers, and advocates working to protect what we have left of the Everglades and to restore some of what we've lost. And we know that restoring the Everglades is key to our future in South Florida. The Everglades recharges the Biscayne Aquifer, which provides clean drinking water to over 9 million people. And restoring the Everglades also provides our inland communities with greater protection from intense storm surge, hurricane winds, and flooding, all of which are likely to intensify in the years ahead. And so the good news is more and more people are coming to understand the value of protecting the Everglades and all of our natural lands and waters. And so I'm going to shift now a little bit and share some exciting new insight about Floridians' perspectives on conservation. Earlier this year, NPCA partnered with the Business and Economics Polling Initiative at FAU to understand Floridians' perspectives on conservation issues. And before we get into the results, I wanted to very informally poll this group a bit. So I'm asking all of you, what % of Floridians do you think would agree that our leaders have an obligation to restore the Everglades? What percentage of people do you think would agree that restoring the Everglades is a priority? And I would invite you to pop that in the chat. We'll take a look at some of the guesses. Okay, I'm seeing 50%, 70%, 80%, 50%, 60, 80. Okay, well, I have good news for all of you, in that it was actually 86% of Floridians who said they agree that our leaders have an obligation to protect and restore the Everglades. We were absolutely thrilled with some of these numbers and have even more good news to share. 85% of people specifically in Miami-Dade County agree that the Everglades and our sensitive lands and waters should be protected from harmful overdevelopment. This fact in particular, we're hoping will be a really useful advocacy tool because we are often fighting bad development threats in Miami-Dade that threaten not only the Everglades, but also Biscayne Bay. And so we can really go to the county commissioners and assure them that most people in Miami-Dade value conserving our natural resources instead of seeing continued overdevelopment. 87% of Floridians support increased protections for our coral reefs, which are, of course, also a hugely important resource and a natural treasure. 85% of people, specifically in Miami-Dade, again, said they would support using more intense conservation tools like marine protected areas and no fishing zones to make sure that we're building healthy ocean and marine ecosystems. 85% of Floridians agree that our parks should be protected from oil drilling and mining, which unfortunately is a significant threat in the Western Everglades and in Big Cypress. And so these are all great numbers. What do we learn from this and what can we take away? So first of all, we have claimed for many years that Everglades restoration is a bipartisan issue, and now we have the proof because the respondents from this poll were almost evenly split among Republicans, Democrats, and independents. And when we looked at the responses from any political alignment, they all were very strongly in support of conservation and Everglades restoration, which is great news. We also can say with certainty that Floridians are already feeling the impact of climate change. This is not a future problem. This is a today problem, and we need today's solutions. 87% of people in Miami-Dade reported that they've already experienced climate impacts to some degree in their daily lives, which is significant. Something really interesting was that longtime Floridians, people who said they lived in Florida for 25 years or more, were 3 times more likely to agree that we should protect our sensitive lands and waters than those folks who indicated they'd moved to Florida just in the past year. So what does this show us? It means we have work to do. It means all of these people moving to Florida need to experience the Everglades, need to experience our waters, understand the value of them, and come to join us as park advocates because more and more people are coming here every day and we need them to understand the value of conservation. We found out with certainty that Floridians of all ages value our national parks, but in particular, the folks who were in the 18 to 35 age range were most likely to say they visited a national park within the past year, which we love to see. We need more and more people enjoying our national parks and becoming park stewards. And one of the really exciting findings was that conservation not only crosses political party lines, but also county lines. This was not a strong opinion from people in South Florida only. This was a response across the board for people who identified as living in North, Central, Southwest, and Southeast Florida. Almost 9 out of 10 said they value the long-term conservation of our state's resources. So that's great news. All of this was really encouraging to our team at NPCA. We are on the ground all throughout Florida working to protect these parks of the Greater Everglades, Everglades, Biscayne, Big Cypress, but also some of the other parks, Timucuan Ecological Preserve in Jacksonville, Gulf Islands National Seashore in the Panhandle. And we know that we have over 100,000 members behind us, and also the general opinion of Florida's public behind us as well. And so there's something really beautiful about the Everglades, and it's not just the birds and the water and the orchids. It's that in this time where our country is more divided than it's ever been, we continue to amazingly have really strong bipartisan support and make significant progress with Everglades restoration. And beyond that, we have so many passionate young people like all of you who've joined today, who care deeply about this place and want to see a restored, resilient Everglades in the years ahead. And so I want to, again, thank you for inviting me to join this webinar today and thank CLEO for the partnership and the opportunity. I hope this has been interesting and shed some light on the journey of the Everglades and the work that we'll continue to do to restore and safeguard this special place. thank you so much, and I'm happy to answer questions.
Thank you so much, Kara. That was awesome. I love the journey that you took us on. And I'm glad that you talked about advocacy because, as you know, at CLEO, that's a huge focus for us, especially among our youth. So, we do have a few questions. So, we'll walk through one at a time. And I want to encourage folks who are on the call to drop your questions in the Q&A box. You can find the function at the bottom of your Zoom. And when we're done with the Q&A, we also have a few announcements. So, stick with us till 4 p.m. The first question we have is, what do models suggest will happen to the Everglades if, as projected, sea levels rise significantly? Will it absorb much of the rise, or will water levels spill over into highly populated areas?
Right. So, a question that I get a lot, though this one was phrased in a much more positive way. The way that I usually get it is, why bother, right? Sea level rise is going to absorb the Everglades. And we know that Everglades restoration is a critical tool to give us more time to adapt. Us as built communities and us as the creatures, the wildlife, the native species who live in South Florida. And so an important part about Everglades restoration is putting more fresh water on the land that can help push back against not only sea level rise, but saltwater intrusion underneath. And as we do that, we're buying time. We're buying more time for species to adapt. And so we do know that some sensitive habitat areas of the Everglades are likely to be inundated, but we also know that with enough time, some species can adapt, can move inland or find other habitat. And so we want to buy ourselves as much time as possible. We also want to protect our drinking water supply to the greatest extent possible. And so the ability of the freshwater of the Everglades to push back against that saltwater intrusion that's creeping into the aquifer underneath is really probably the most compelling case for investing in Everglades restoration with many of our elected leaders, because the value of clean drinking water is well beyond what we need to invest to restore the ecosystem.
Absolutely. Can you talk a little bit about which species might be more at risk as a result of sea level rise in the Everglades?
Sure. We're definitely concerned about foraging birds, those who need fairly dry habitat for their nesting, but also a wet enough habitat to be looking for their food. So some of the species in the Everglades really need to hit that sweet spot, and we want to make sure that those birds in particular are finding the habitat they need to find food and to raise their young, which is tricky.
Thanks. We have a question from Lucas Ryan. From an impact perspective, what is the priority of fighting invasive species?
Well, the main species that people talk about is the python. But the much less exciting invasive species that we're really on the ground fighting is plants. We have a lot of invasive plants that take over habitat. And so the priority is using natural means like fire to manage invasive plants inside Everglades National Park in a way that is cohesive with ecosystem management. We're also interested in investing in science solutions to the snakes and some of those other larger species. So whereas there have been some python hunts, we're really not supportive of people going out into the Everglades to try and hunt pythons. What we've been more interested in is the science of tracking, where some of our partner NGOs have their science teams put a tracking device on a male python who will then visit multiple females and her nests who can be gone and gathered by the science team for removal from the ecosystem. So I think the invasive species threat is significant, but the science to combat, both in terms of ecosystem protection with fire management and tracking science, are two of our greatest tools to combat that.
Thanks, Kara. We have an interesting question here. We know, you talked about this in the beginning. What are the major threats to the Everglades? And we know that pollution is one of those. Someone was asking about the sugarcane industry and how that's harming the Everglades. Can you expand a little bit on that for us?
I could give you a whole other hour on sugar, but I'll try to keep it reasonable. So there are two main reasons that the sugar industry is really harming the Everglades. And one is its runoff and its air quality impacts. So interestingly, when sugar is harvested, there are two ways you could harvest sugar. One is manually, and one is by burning. And so the manual way or using machines is a lot more time intensive and a lot more expensive, but it also has ecological benefits. It's less harmful. But the burning way is a lot faster, is a lot cheaper, and causes a lot of those pesticides and fertilizers to burn up into the air. And what we're seeing is that the sugar industries in Florida do use that burning method, and it creates a toxic ash that falls in and around the communities of the Glades, many of which are lower income communities, to the fact that some of the schools, even in the Belglade and Clewiston area, when there are burning days, they show up to the school playground and there's snow days. There's gray snow on their playground, which is really just the pollution ash from burning sugarcane. So the air impacts are significant. Of course, that pollution is also getting into Lake Okeechobee, which flows down to the Everglades. And it's really unregulated. It's really a huge environmental justice issue. And I'm not quite doing the issue justice in my description here, but would encourage you to check out the work by Sierra Club and Friends of the Everglades, who are really trying to bring to light the significant issues around sugarcane burning. The other main issue with sugar is how much land they have. So if you look at a map of Lake Okeechobee through the Everglades and we want to make a restored river of grass, there's a huge dead zone where the sugar companies own so much land that we can't restore. And so, it's a combination of blocking the flow of water and adding so much pollutants into the air and water that together make that industry really harmful for the Everglades and for all of us living here.
Thanks, Kara. I think there are a lot of competing threats to the Everglades, and you talked a little bit about some of the advocacy that NPCA has done. I was curious, are there any opportunities for residents to take action through NPCA? And the reason I asked this is because you talked about all those amazing surveys that demonstrate that people want these areas to be conserved, but there's a difference between wanting and then kind of going to the next level and taking action to make sure that those areas are preserved. So something we do a lot at CLEO is moving people from the alarm stage into the activated stage. And I know a lot of folks on this call are really into advocacy and would like to take action. So I'd love it if you could expand a little bit on, are there any opportunities through NPCA that people could take on the Everglades or on any of the other national parks?
Yeah, absolutely. So I would say that the easiest route is to sign up for NPCA action alerts, and you'll get those easy email action alerts that you can put in your zip code and it'll go right to your representative. I'm sure the engaged folks who are on this webinar likely receive those from several organizations. Next up would be local advocacy. So I'd say this is especially relevant if you have any folks who are in Miami-Dade County or in Collier County, because these are two of the areas where development threats are significant and are ongoing. And especially, I'll say, in Miami-Dade County, there are ongoing development threats where there are actual footprints for Everglades restoration projects that are threatened by development of a new logistics center, or we recently were involved with opposing the new water park by Zoo Miami. And the commissioners in Miami-Dade County really, for better or worse, probably for worse, only want to hear from Miami-Dade County residents. So if you are a Miami-Dade County resident, you have a very powerful voice to contact your county commissioner and emphasize to them that you don't want to see continued sprawl, but you want to see preservation of our natural areas and of our open space. Because we know that even an area that isn't pristine Everglades habitat, all open space has value. All open space has preservation value. And so we are really involved, and we have an Everglades fellow. His name is Marcelo Balderas, based in Miami, who heads up our advocacy in Miami-Dade. And so folks who are interested can sign up for those alerts. For people who are like, I want to go further, we also do every year during the state legislative session an Everglades Day in Tallahassee. So NPCA will fund a charter bus that leaves from Miami, picks up people in Miami, Broward, Palm Beach, and Stewart. And then we go up to Tallahassee. We're in advocacy teams. We meet with legislators in support of funding Everglades restoration. And we also have, as part of our agenda, requests for stronger growth management rules back in the state of Florida. trying to pursue an Everglades protection area where some of these areas would be protected from overdevelopment at the state level. So those are, I would say, the three options. You got your online advocacy, which is significant, local advocacy, especially if you're in like a development hotspot. And then if you really want to consider coming up to the state capitol and being a boots on the ground advocate, we have that option as well.
That's great. Jocelyn just shared the link to sign up for NPCA's action alerts. We'll also share that in the follow-up email. And if you're from Miami-Dade County, it's really good to know who your commissioner is. They make really important decisions on a local scale that impact you directly. So we highly recommend that you click that link, find out who your commissioner is if you don't, and contact them if you have any concerns or anything that you'd like to chat about. Or you can come. CLEO attends a lot of commission meetings alongside groups like NPCA and others to advocate for different policies that impact climate. We have a really good question here. Someone's asking, are there studies that show the economic benefits of investing in solutions to avoid damages to the Everglades later, like an economic estimate of the benefits that ecosystem services provide and the cost that we would avoid by investing in Everglades protection now? I imagine on the scale of hundreds of millions of dollars needed to be invested versus billions in damage, perhaps. I think this is along the lines of money invested now can save us 6 times the amount of money in the future.
Right. A figure that we use often was from an economic study commissioned by the Everglades Foundation that every dollar invested in Everglades restoration has a $4 return. And, you know, by all accounts, we think that's a conservative number because once you take into account also the economic benefits of like the real estate industry and the tourism industry, and you start adding in all of these others, a 4-to-1 return on investment is pretty conservative. So has anybody put an ecosystem value on the Everglades? Not that I know of. But what we do talk about a bit more pragmatically when we're going to meet with elected leaders is we know that project costs go up year to year. So a project that might cost $1,000 today could cost $3,000 if we wait 2 more years. And especially on these projects where we're already in the middle, we know that delays are costly. And especially for folks who are fiscal conservatives, that's a compelling argument. So we often talk about the construction costs associated with delay. I know that wasn't quite the question, so I guess my answer is no, I don't think anybody has put an ecosystem service value on the Everglades, but I would love to see it.
That's great. Yeah, I think there are very few studies out there that have actually put a value on ecosystem services because of the interconnectedness of ecosystem components. And so it's really difficult to put a number on it without either doing it justice or injustice. And so I remember doing research on this, and the most recent one was done in 2011. Maybe something more recent has come out, but certainly making the economic case is something that resonates a lot with our elected officials. Someone's asking about partnerships. Obviously, we all do the work we do in collaboration. Someone was asking if you've collaborated with in your conservation efforts with the Florida Wildlife Corridor organization.
Yes, definitely. And actually, my colleague Marissa Carozzo, who's our wildlife program manager, works really closely with a lot of those folks. There's a lot of alignment with especially the efforts to protect contiguous areas of panther habitat through the Western Everglades. And again, this is an area where we consistently see Floridians and even our state legislature showing a lot of support. So we're excited about the Florida Wildlife Corridor. We do partner with them, and I'm hopeful that they'll get a lot of good conservation work done in the years ahead.
That's great. We have time for one more question before we do our outro and invite folks to our field trip. So with all of the challenges and opportunities, what do you see, how do you see the Everglades in the next 10 years? I know it's a big question, but.
Sure. I'm really excited to honestly say I see a number of major restoration projects coming online and being done. So Tamiami Trail was one example of a project that I shared that's going to be totally done next year. There are Tamiami Trail scale projects happening all across the ecosystem. One south of Lake Okeechobee to build a giant reservoir. There's one happening by the Caloosahatchee River to clean and store water, another in the St. Lucie. So as we see more of these projects completed, we're going to phase into construction and out of construction and into operations. So what does that look like? Does it mean the Everglades is restored and we set it free? Unfortunately not. That vision of a fully restored natural Everglades is likely gone, but it means a system that is thoughtfully managed and where we have the tools to flow water where it needs to go when it makes sense. This will benefit not only the ecosystem, but also those of us who live here. So here's an example. We have a large water storage reservoir, and the water managers know that we're predicting a very wet hurricane season. And so they can choose to lower the water levels in that reservoir to accommodate more storm surge when it comes in and protect nearby communities. So when we talk about Everglades restoration, we're really talking about managing water in South Florida. And the more projects we have complete, the more flexibility we have to do that in a way that keeps people and wildlife and water quality in mind.
That's great. Thank you so much, Kara. We don't have that much more time for questions, but if you'd like to send us an email, we can share them with Kara. I would just like to share a really great opportunity that's been made possible because of the National Parks Conservation Association and this partnership that we've had with them for the past few years. We've been offering free field trips to our youth Gen CLEO members. We went to Biscayne National Park and did snorkeling and canoeing. We went to Big Cypress National Preserve last year and did a wet walk. And this year on July 24th, we're going to be visiting Everglades National Park and doing an airboat tour ride in partnership also with the Everglades Foundation. So I'm encouraging everyone to scan the QR code. Jocelyn will drop the link in the chat. And again, this is open to only our youth Gen CLEO members. We offer transportation, lunch, and everything is taken care of. So we'd love to see you there in July. If you'd like to stay up to date on CLEO in terms of the actions that we're taking, actions that you can take, and updates on our work, you can sign up for our newsletter. And finally, I would like to thank the National Parks Conservation Association for your incredible partnership, for this incredible webinar, and we look forward to working with you in the future. So thank you everybody for joining us today. And we'll be following up with an email on Friday, so you can expect to see that in your inbox. Thank you so much, everyone.